everyone, and welcome to this episode of Love Like Crazy. We're your hosts, Jay and Stacey Coleman. Thank you so much for joining in, because we're going to talk about something today that is very dear to my heart. We're going to be talking about grief and loss. And joining us today is going to be our friend Lindsey Hornsby, who is a professional licensed counselor, and she has just found her way into helping people deal with grief and loss.
And I just want to take a moment, Lindsey, before we dive in. We got a lot to talk about today. But before we dive off into this, you guys know every episode we love to talk about how much we appreciate you guys helping us to build this podcast. And if you're enjoying this, please like, subscribe, share, give us a comment, leave us a review. And we love to hear feedback from you guys. So thank you so much. And I know that today, I'm excited about the episode today, because not only you're talking about she's a licensed professional counselor, but she's also a really good friend to us. And we've known you and Roger for many, many years now. And whenever it comes to the topic that we're going to talk about today, I like to say it like this: everybody's least favorite topic, grief. But it's actually something that every single person eventually deals with. I don't care who you are. They say that two things are in life are certain: death and taxes. We will all face that moment where we have loss within our life. And so thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being here with us. So let's do this. Let's dive off into this. And why don't you just take a moment, kind of tell us a little bit about you, tell us about your family.
About my family and me. Okay, so I, like you said, I'm married to Roger Hornsby. We've been married almost 20 years, which is hard to believe because I still think of us as being so young. But we met on the first day that the new campus of our church opened. So that's when I met him.
You saw him there and you were like, there's the man for me.
Yeah.
You went to church to meet a guy.
Yeah, no, actually I had a boyfriend. He saw that.
Oh, no.
Roger's like, I can break them up.
Yeah. So met him that day, been together for almost 20 years, and we have two beautiful children, Knox and Letty, and they're almost 10 and almost 6. So
oh my goodness,
they're
wonderful.
precious.
That is awesome. Now I know this because we've referred a lot of people to you for counseling throughout the years, and the time came where you decided, I want to step back and take on the most important role to me, and that's being a wife, being a stay-at-home mom. And I know that you've enjoyed that role very much.
I really have. I am making the best of it, doing all the, baking and cooking and gardening and all those things.
Yeah. I was going to say, you live out in the country, so you get to do a lot of those kind of things.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
Now, our listeners don't know this, but you live in the big metropolis of Bluff Creek.
Yes.
And there's about 4 people that live out there.
Yes, mostly cows and chickens.
Oh, my goodness.
And I think all the other residents out there have the last name Hornsby.
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely true.
Yes.
But it's, as we talk about this topic today, one of the things that I've done, there's a lot of people who come in, and I like to tell people I'm not a professional counselor. Stacey and I both say that.
We can pray with you. We can talk with you.
Yeah,
yes.
we can help give you some guidance.
Be a listening ear.
Yeah, a lot of times we refer people to counselors, and we referred people to you. And I know through the years I've jokingly tried to pull you back into it, like, come on back. But I'm curious how you actually got it. Tell Stacey and I how did it come about you going into counseling? Was that in your heart from being from high school forward, or like how did it all come to you being a counselor?
Actually, no, I did not start out in counseling. I started out in nursing.
Really?
So yeah,
I did not know that.
So at that time I was at Southeastern, and I went there for about 6 years for nursing. I worked as a nursing assistant at Women's Hospital for several years. And even though I loved the work and I loved the people, I just knew in my heart that it wasn't my calling. It just wasn't. And I was having a conversation one Wednesday night before church with our pastoral counselor, who's a friend of mine, Pastor Paul Downing. And he's our counselor, our pastoral counselor at the church. And we were just talking, and he was like, you really sound a lot like me. And because what we were talking about is, a lot of people, when they go to the grocery store or to any type of social event, and you say, hey, how are you doing? People say, I'm fine. How are you? Well, when I ask that question to people, it's never, I'm fine. It's they open up, and we might be there for 15 or 20 minutes, or I'm praying with them. I share a really funny story about how one time I somehow ended up overhearing a conversation in Cato's dressing room, and ended up going into the dressing room with a lady who was not fully dressed, and prayed with her for her son So it just ends up that way. For whatever reason, God has gifted me with maybe just a personality that seems open, and people just open up to me. So he said, you really would probably thrive in counseling. So I switched my major at that point and finished up with a bachelor's in psychology, and then went from there to get my master's at Liberty University, which is an amazing Christian university, and got my master's of marriage and family therapy there. And then it just went from there.
Maybe one of our listeners is that lady in that dressing room for Cato.
Oh,
She's like,
she
hey,
may
that
very
She
well.
is. I would
That
love
was
for her to
me.
reach out. Yeah, her son had cancer, and he had been in treatment for a long time, and it was the first date that she and her husband were going to go
Oh, wow.
on since the treatment started. So she was
going
looking
to
for an
buy a new
outfit.
outfit.
Yeah, and my
Yes.
heart went out to her, and I said, "Can I pray with you?" And she said, "Come on in." So it was too funny.
Oh my goodness.
But it was a
When I
blessing.
know when we talk about counseling, you and I have had these conversations about grief.
Yeah.
And when it comes to dealing with grief, everybody at some point is going to deal with that. Everybody deals with
gonna
it
affect you,
differently.
yes.
I know that whenever we first got married, or when we met, started dating, she had lost her mom a few years prior.
Right.
And I was just kind of at that point, 18, 19, 20 years old. And I'm just like, oh, you'll be okay, and not really understanding. I was just kind of ignorant in that regards because I had never really dealt with grief in my life. I'd lost a great grandma and things like that, but had never really personally lost somebody that I was really close with. And walking with her through the loss that she's incurred within her life, it's taught me a lot throughout the years.
Yeah.
And of course, being the age I am, we've lost people who are close to us as well. So, Stacey said that this is a topic that's dear to her heart because she likes to help people walk through this.
Yeah, I think since recently in the last few years, I have been more open with the loss that I've experienced in my life. I lost my mom when I was 18. My dad has also passed away. We've lost some very close friends over the years. And then my grandmother, I affectionately call her Granny, she passed away 2 years ago. And whenever I lost my granny, I immediately was like, okay, I need to talk to someone, because when I was younger, it really wasn't a thing to go and seek help. And so I immediately had her service on the Sunday, and by Wednesday morning, I was in a grief share class. I jumped in the middle of like week 7, and I found it to be extremely helpful. And since I've been able to process more of my grief and realize that I was carrying things along the way over the years, it has been so helpful for me. So I admire you using that as your ministry to help those that are grieving. And so, I want us to talk about how can we help others who are processing loss, because it's not something that's really talked about. But since I've been more open with our church and with others about my loss and how that I am processing it with the Lord's help, then more people are coming to me, because they want prayer, or, how did this affect you, and how can it
just
help
some support.
them? Some support.
Yeah.
Actually, that's what Grief Share was to me, and what we even have offered at our church in the past.
Well, I'm curious because, we've had conversations in the past about, you going into counseling, but, grief's not necessarily the direction that a lot of counselors are going to go to school and be like, oh, I'm going to school to be a grief counselor, help people walk through this. How did you wind up going in that direction?
Well, all counselors, obviously, like you said, because everyone is going to deal with losing someone at some point in their life. So all of us deal with grief and walk with people through that season of their lives. But for me, it was something different. I was sought out as a counselor that was hired for a funeral home, and they were looking to provide a service for the people that the families that would utilize their services. And they developed a grief support group, and it was a whole program. It was a bereavement program, and it was a monthly grief support group. And then it was individual counseling for people who were having a tougher time. Maybe they had a tragic loss, one that wasn't so expected, or just even if it was expected, everyone goes through that process differently. And so for people who are having a harder time, I would see them individually as clients of mine at the funeral home.
Is that common that a funeral home would have a grief counselor or have a grief, like
class
like
or
a
support
class
group?
or
It's
support
really
group?
not that common that they would have a counselor on site or one on staff, but it is very common that they do support groups
Okay.
and, at least offer resources for people
Referrals,
to, have those types of services. So
I will say this much, that to me, that is like it's genius. Or I get it's very compassionate for them to be able to have somebody on site who can help the
Yeah.
family.
And very
'Cause
much needed.
A lot of times when families, they go to the funeral, they're in such shock, they don't know how to process. I've had people call me, Pastor Jay, we need you to help us walk us through this process, just because they're like I said, they're in shock, they don't know what to do.
right. And well, one thing that I'll point out is that, like Stacey said, whenever she lost her granny and after all of the other accumulated loss over your life, you decided, you know what, I'm going to be more active about this.
Yes.
And I find that people who are more active about that process of grieving, they really do have a better outcome and they're able to process through it a little bit better. Even if they don't go to a professional counselor for it, it's just good to just know what to expect, if nothing else. Really.
And to be around other people who have also experienced loss. And I've found that it really doesn't matter the exact loss. You can have a room full of people who have lost a parent, lost a child, lost a friend, whatever the situation. And it's just the coming together of the commonality of we have experienced something, and we have each other to support. Like, hey, how I'm feeling, but
What I'm walking through.
You know what I'm walking through. Though there are the specific difficulties when it is the loss of a child versus the loss of a parent, but overall, that having that in common and that community helps you to process your grief and to move
that's
forward.
one thing that I learned when I did the monthly support group is that I was a little bit surprised how a lot of the people would come together and say, it's such a blessing to come here and to not know you people because everyone grieves in a different way. They express their emotions in a different way. And sometimes, whenever a family experiences a great loss together, they process it in their own individual ways. And sometimes it can get exhausting for, let's say it's a child coming to their parent for the loss, or if a husband or a father is lost, it's really difficult and you can exhaust those relationships sometimes. And so it's really neat to see how you get around people who don't really know your specific story, but they can say, oh yeah, me too. I'm going through that as well. I can relate to that,
Maybe you feel like, oh, what I'm feeling is normal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because a lot of times I think that everybody who there's a lot of people who give you a lot of, opinions whenever you're walking through something and you're like, well, is this normal or is this not normal? But to be around people who you realize, oh, I'm dealing with this. I'm not able to snap out of it and move forward after 2 weeks after the funeral. So this is normal that I'm walking through this.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's important though, having that support group to be able to just talk about your loved one, because a lot of times in certain family dynamics, and I'm kind of speaking from my own family dynamic, when we lost my mom, my dad, my mom was like 41. So my dad was really young, still having I was in college, but still having his kids at home and losing his wife. But his way of dealing with it was not to deal with it. And it was almost as if we were not allowed to talk about her. And so that was such a hindrance, to us being able to process any kind of grief if you can't talk about her. So it ended up where if I could find someone that I could talk about her with, it was helpful, to me. But yes, definitely the different family dynamics and almost kind of feeling like you have to carry the grief for someone else in your family as well. Like you have to be strong for them, which keeps you from processing your own grief.
And I think for me, I meet her 2 years after her mom passed away. She's 20 years old at this time. And in my mind, as immature as I was, I'm not thinking like you're still grieving and walking through this. I'm thinking like, oh, well, that's in the past.
Yeah,
you should be good
you've gone
now.
past it. Yeah.
And I've shared in a past episode about how on our honeymoon, she sat on the end of the bed and we get to the hotel and I'm dealing with the luggage and I hear something turn around. She's sitting on the end of the bed crying. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what did I do? And she, not knowing all the happiness of the day, but now she's grieving because it's settled in that I had to do this without my mom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I was just being immature, did not really know how to deal with that. So let's do this. Let's talk about some of the ways that maybe grief it manifests, it shows itself in people's life. Because a lot of times, like you talk about your dad, we're not talking about it. We're going to cover it up. We're not going to deal with it. But what are ways that grief shows itself?
Okay, so many different ways. And like you said, sometimes people will suppress that grief, but the problem with that is it's always going to come to the surface.
In one way or another.
And so it can come out in your physical health, obviously, because during the grieving process, it's very normal for your immune system to be low anyway, because all of your energy is spent emotionally.
Yes.
And so your immune system is just low. And so people, it's really wise to make sure that you're eating healthy, you're exercising, you're getting sunlight, and all those other things that we should be doing anyway, but you don't want to do those things at this time. So you have to just put one foot in front of the other sometimes and make sure that you are, or oftentimes you will find yourself sick. And then obviously emotionally it can come out and it can look like lots of tears and it can look like anger. Because a lot of people have a really rough time, especially depending on the situation of the death. Yeah. And so
Seeing a lot of people get angry at God.
Absolutely. In a time where, you
need to be drawing close to the Lord.
Drawing to Him so that He can bind up that broken heart,
Yeah. I have found, because this has been so recent with my granny, and we just in the last few months settled all of her affairs, sold her house, all of that. And it's like, until I got to that place of closure, and even when I had to go and sign and do a lot of different things, I found myself extremely irritable and irritable with him and nothing that he did. Poor thing, he took.
I can vouch for that.
And so we do that. We do take it out on the ones around us.
I think it's because you feel safe with that person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And then I didn't even realize how irritable I was, but it was just the stress of it, the anticipation of having to deal with it, the letting go of things, because you're having to release, these things that have, been so dear to you all of your life whenever you lose someone. And one of the things that I found helpful when I took the grief share classes, and then I also facilitated them recently, was how they talked about, people want to come to someone who's grieving and say, okay, well, you need to move on now, like that, like you were thinking, well, that was years ago, you should be doing better by now. And it's not that we want or need to move on, because moving on implies that you're leaving that person behind. But what's important is that we begin to process our feelings, our emotions, and therefore we're moving forward. Yeah. And so I think that was like a light bulb that came on for me, that, okay, I don't need to move on, and we're not going to forget this person that was so dear to us. There's just no way that's not going to happen, but we can move forward with our lives, and process everything.
Well, how do people process, when it comes to grief? What is there a process to processing?
Well, there is. Yeah. It doesn't look the same for every person, but obviously, like we're talking about, sharing with other people, we can talk to God about these things, obviously, and He is near to the brokenhearted, but we're created to be relational. Right. And so when we share things with one another, the grief is divided, you have your marriage podcast. And so whenever we love one another, another, it's multiplied. But when we share grief, it's divided. And so that's how it's meant to be. So that helps us process. There are many different things that people do in our culture. Obviously, we have a funeral that helps to sort of finalize, because you see the person there, and it's a final thing. It's a ceremony to memorialize them. You hear all the stories, but really that's part of it too, is hearing people talk about your loved ones. So talking about them and keeping them alive, so to speak, in spirit and in just in your memories and that type of thing. So it really does. Some people like to go to the grave sites. Other people do not. Whenever I was counseling with people who were having a hard time, I'd say, what feels best to you? What feels best to you? Talking to them out loud, just as though you're talking to them, going to the graveyard, whatever it is, do those things. And I always like to be sure that people just felt like whatever they were doing to remember that person was normal.
Normal and okay.
It's normal. And it's not depression. Okay. When you're grieving, a lot of people say, oh, well, they're depressed. Well, yeah. Yes, they are. They have a depressed mood because something tragic has happened in their life and they have lost a great part of their life. And so it's very normal to experience depressed emotions and have behaviors that look like depression, but this is not the same thing as your major depressive disorder as a disorder.
So you're saying grief is not clinical depression.
Exactly.
You are depressed because you've lost somebody, but
Exactly.
it's not clinical depression.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and I think it's accepting that and just moving forward in that. And let me ask you this, and you can tell me if I'm safe in saying this or not. There's a lot of times people, whenever it comes to maybe a friend or somebody has lost a child or something of that nature, it's like people feel like they were walking on eggshells around that person because they don't want to exasperate the situation or make the person hurt any worse than they are. And so maybe they don't talk about that person or don't mention that person's name.
They're afraid to say their name.
They're afraid to say their name. But is it common that person wants to talk about that person because they don't want that person to be forgotten?
Right. It is usually quite the opposite of wanting to tiptoe around it and not mention them because it's too painful. Okay. It is painful, but it's also very healing to have that person remembered.
Right.
And to talk
about
them.
the fun times and the laughter and the different things. Yeah. We had lost a very close friend. It's probably been almost 15 years now that he was like, we called him Uncle Carl to our boys. And he passed away suddenly. And one of the things that I specifically was intentional about was we would talk about him all the time to the boys, like, oh my gosh, did you know that was his favorite movie? If Uncle Carl was here, he would tell you about, this, that, or the other. And because I experienced that with my dad, not wanting to talk about my mom, I was like, no, we're going to. And because my mom passed away when I was younger, Jay did not get to meet her. So therefore my kids did not know her. But do you know that they feel as if they knew her because I talked about her and incorporated her within our lives, the memory of her. And so I think that's so very important. And people, they want you to talk about their loved one.
Okay. Well, let's broach, since you brought that topic up, let's broach that subject of how do you help your kids deal with grief, whether it's a grandparent or a friend or whoever it might be. A lot of times, unfortunately, what you experienced and your sister experienced, she was much younger than you. We don't talk about that person, and that's not healthy. No. How can we help our kiddos deal with grief whenever they're...
So, one of the things that I have learned in this journey of mine on, grief counseling and helping people is that in our American culture, we are so disassociated with death and dying just because we're so progressed in our technologies and all of those different types of things. So we don't, as adults, have to deal with it very much in terms of the entire process. So if someone's sick, they go to the hospital.
And they get fixed.
And they get fixed usually, okay? And then if not, they immediately are taken to the morgue or the funeral home, and then someone else takes care of the remains of the person's body. And then we go and, have the visitation, and then someone else buries them. Well, think about 100, 200, years ago, it wasn't that way. I mean, families were very closely associated with death and dying, and even did some of those, processes themselves.
So what you're saying is it's really removed from our lives today.
It has been. And so people will actually shudder at, physically draw away, whenever someone wants to talk about, death or dying and that type of thing. And so we have a tendency as adults, and then passing that along to our kids, just kind of just shoving it out of the way until it's absolutely necessary. And then we don't know what to do. So I think it's very important, like Stacey said, that is such a great way to do it. It's just to continue to talk to them about it, make that a safe space, crying with them and in front of them, that's really an important thing. Our kids need to see us grieve and how it's done well. Okay. I mean, some people, don't do it the most healthy ways. They may self-medicate or, some of those more negative ways, but to see it done in a healthy way and to talk about it and to cry some and, to say, well, today I'm just having a hard day. I'm just missing, so that type of thing. And then
being
other thing,
them.
just being honest. Because if they're asking questions, especially, they're usually ready for an age-appropriate answer. Their little minds are wondering, what do I do with this? And so, that's what I would say is to approach the topic to them in an age-appropriate way, whatever age they are. For little ones, you can do little memorial boxes, or, some people do the balloon releases and just all different sorts of things like that. But just normalizing the fact that grief is sad and there has been a loss. That's the most important.
I thought it was kind of cool what our friend did with her husband's shirt. She had pillows made for the grandkids. Pillowcases made out of the shirts, and I thought that was kind of a neat thing.
There's a lot of neat things like that.
And you're seeing more and more of this versus, years ago, people really didn't talk about it or deal with it. But now I kind of feel like maybe now people are a little bit more open to this. Counseling, in fact, was one of the things that years ago, you don't go see a counselor, that means you're weak. And now people are talking about, there is an openness to going and getting counseling and getting grief counseling.
Yeah, I once told my granny, because my mom was her daughter and she grieved so deeply for her. And I told her one time, I said, if we would have all gone to counseling, or if we would have all had somebody to talk to when we first experienced the loss, how much further along, or how much better it would have been for us. And I definitely love the idea, and tell this to people often, about doing something special in memory of that person, especially when there's children involved, that you need to do that, to represent that, celebrate their memory. One of the things that I started doing, since my granny's been gone a couple of years now, is I used to always send her, she didn't live here, she lived a couple hours away, and I would always send her a poinsettia for Christmas. And so I got really sad, like, I can't send her a poinsettia. So I went down to Sam's Club, bought 2 large poinsettias and put them by my front door. And so that is now my new tradition. I'm going to continue to buy a poinsettia in her memory, because that's something that I miss being able to do. And I think it's okay to talk about, like, hey, I'm doing this to honor the memory of this person, and it be an open communication thing.
Well, I love that, being able to keep that memory alive of that person. I also want to kind of broach this topic as well. As a minister, a lot of times I have to conduct funeral services, and it is a blessing to be able to speak, for people, speak on their behalf of their life. I've encountered people who are grieving with the hope of Christ, and people who are grieving without the hope of Christ. In other words, they don't believe in Christ, or somebody who is a Christian. And Paul actually wrote about, those who grieve with hope versus those who don't in Thessalonians. And have you, working in the funeral home, dealing with people through that process of grief, do you see a difference there within people?
There is a difference. obviously the people who have hope, they tend to do better.
Yeah.
That's just kind of a given to me as a Christian. But what you will see, though, is that when someone loses someone very close to them, that is the realest and rawest that they'll ever be. And so it's an opportunity for us as Christians to
share
Christ with them. And it's not anything that you want to fill in the gaps in terms of, pushing it down their throat or any of that type of thing. But it's an opportunity, I think, that God gives us in that process for them. And if God puts somebody in your life who has lost someone, we should be taking that opportunity, because eternity is just as real.
Right.
As death.
And to help them understand that Christ is the one who can bring peace to your heart through this time of mourning, and he's near to the brokenhearted, is a powerful thing. And it's when you are a believer and you're walking through that time of grief, you draw strength from knowing that there's people praying for you. You draw strength from the presence of Christ within your life. So that's why I agree with you. It's a time that you can really, not shoving it down people's throats, but being able to pray with them, to minister to them, and share the hope of Christ with them. It's also great. I've seen this side of it as well, that people value the community that they have within their church family. People don't know what to do a lot of times whenever somebody passes away. So what do? They cook, and they show up with a cake or a casserole, something of that nature. Or they're calling, texting, letting people know we're praying for you. Yeah. So that community is very, very valuable.
It really is. And more than, like I said, filling in those gaps, because one of the things, like I think you mentioned it earlier, people try to say all kinds of things to people who are grieving and well, he or she is in a better place, or, well, we'll see them again in heaven, or at least they're not suffering, or whatever. We as humans really do. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing is, I learned that, and I had to train people, to understand that. Please don't get angry with your friends and family when they try to fill that space. They want to see you be okay. And so it makes us, as people, very uncomfortable when the people that we love are not okay. And so they just want to say something that's meaningful. But really the most important thing that you can do is just show up.
You just be there.
Hug them, go do their dishes. Go do their laundry, go drop off some groceries on their porch, cut their grass, whatever it is, just be a presence and a support in that way. Yeah. You don't have to say much.
Right. And community is so important, because when you're going through the grief, that shock, that there's just this feeling of like, almost kind of like things are standing still, and it's almost hard to put one foot in front of the other to do anything, to get out of bed, and so it's so helpful that when you do have that community and friends that will just step up and do for you, it's not necessarily that you have to say anything, but your actions speak a lot of love. Yeah. Definitely.
Well, so I think it's valuable to say that community is important, whether it's community with your church family or joining a support group. I know for you, y'all kind of talked about this about Grief Share. Mm-hmm. Grief Share was very valuable. I know whenever she lost her grandmother, she comes to me, she says, I'm not going to, this time kind of sit on the sidelines and do nothing. This time I'm going to Grief Share. I'm going to see a counselor. And I'm like, I fully support you in whatever it is that you need to do. And it was kind of funny because the Grief Share group that she joined, she was like the young in there. Everybody had lost their spouse. They were in their 70s, 80s.
It's true. Well, I went on the Grief Share website and I put in the zip code to see what places, what churches offered Grief Share. And then, so I picked the time that was most convenient for me, which was Wednesday mornings. Yeah. So I decided to drive into downtown Baton Rouge on Wednesday mornings and meet with this precious group. And they were so welcoming to me. Mm-hmm. And I sat there one time and I thought, Granny would have loved this. This was just because she was such an extrovert. And they asked me, will you stay and eat lunch with us? Will you visit with us? And in itself was healing to me, to be put in the middle of the older generation, the age of what my granny was. And
like you had a whole room full of grandpas and
I did. And they were just so very encouraging to me. And I could ask them, certain questions like, how did you, work through this and different things. And they were just so very honoring to,
So what is the website for that?
griefshare.org.
Yes.
Is where you
And
go.
Grief Share, if some of you don't know what that is, Stacey has explained it pretty well. It's a community organization that in your local area, you can type in your zip code and it will show you any church or any place that is offering this. And it's a 13-week program.
Yes.
It's a curriculum. There's a book that you work through, and it's like a 30-minute video, and then it's a support group, and you go over questions and discussion after, and it's just very helpful. It's for anybody. It doesn't have to be loss of a specific person.
Right.
It's spouses, children, parents, whomever. And so it's really, really helpful to so many people. But then otherwise, there are grief support groups that a lot of churches and even funeral homes, hospice services sometimes provide those types of things, monthly or weekly grief support groups. And then individual counseling, if you're having a harder time or maybe you don't feel comfortable around other people just yet, getting in touch with a professional counselor or a pastor at your church, that is very, very helpful. Like we said earlier, just being proactive about it.
Yes. And I think that's what you have to be. You have to say, okay, I'm going to step out and I'm going to do this. Like I did with Grief Share. I jumped in the middle. And I think a lot of times it's like, oh, well, I'll wait till the next Grief Share class starts, or, there's just all kinds of excuses that we put out to like push it aside. And I just encourage all of our listeners to, be proactive, jump in and build that community and get the support that you need.
Well, you even went as far as after going through the Grief Share, program, you actually offered it at our church.
Yes. And I was going to say, and I sought out a specific grief counselor as well. But yes, I did. I offered it at our church and had a huge turnout and a large class. I feel that we went through all of the the curriculum, and it was extremely helpful. There was such a need. I really saw what a need there was for that.
Well, so I think a couple takeaways today as we wrap up this episode is don't be reactive, be proactive. Step out and get the help you need. Find a great support group, whether it's through your church, whether it's through seeing a grief counselor, whether it's going through Grief Share, whatever it might be.
Also tell us the website of where they can go to search for a counselor.
Okay, so there is one that is called Psychology Today, and you can search for any type of counselor. You can search for male or female in your area. That's a very helpful one that you can find some resources for.
That's good.
Well, it's been. I know this kind of sounds ironic to say this has been fun today.
Yeah, well, this has been a great conversation, and I needed one.
Yeah.
And I do hope that our listeners, find this helpful, and that we begin to process these feelings that we have when you experience loss. It's so, so very important not to isolate yourself and to get the help that's needed. And it's okay to do that.
Well, I think let me say it this way. It's been informative today. It's been fun because we get to hang out with our friends and talk about this. But Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Yeah.
So, and listen, if you guys have enjoyed this podcast, make sure that you you subscribe, you share, leave a comment. If there's a particular topic that you would like for us to talk about, leave a comment. We would love to talk about the different ideas that maybe you have, and give us a review as well. Help us continue to grow this podcast, as we are all about building a stronger family and a stronger marriage. And as always, I'm Jay.
And I'm Stacey.
And this is Love Like Crazy.